Okay, I am now recording. Hello, historians. Today, the role of student will be played by my mom, Rita, because I hate talking to an empty room. I'm going to keep saying that because she's doing me a big favor listening to my lessons. Thank you, Mommy.
You're welcome, baby.
Okay,
Professor.
Professor Baby. Okay, so before we start, and a lot of my colleagues start every class by letting their students know that we are operating on stolen land. This land that we're on, we call it the land, we call the people who lived here before us the Kesta. We don't actually know what they called themselves, but those are the name that was written down by the Spanish. This is also the land that the Seminoles have been using for thousands of years. So they never ceded the land. They never surrendered. This is Seminole land that we're operating on. If we are in New York, we might be on Algonquin land. So I'm starting this lesson by letting you know when we're talking about the settlers, that's kind of not really true. All these beautiful open lands had been carefully cultivated by the native groups who used it. Many of them were farmers, many of them were semi-nomadic or fully nomadic, and they made sure the land was clear for the animals they hunted to have pasture land. They made sure it was curated land, so it was never unsettled virgin land like the publicity describes. So there were thousands of different Native American groups out here. But in the 1600s, well, 1520, the Spanish got to Mexico. The first case of smallpox recorded was an enslaved man on a Spanish ship had an active case of smallpox. Within like a month of that, many of the Aztecs, no, Maya, Aztecs. Well, anyway, sorry, my mind's getting wibbly. But there were active cases, and in some towns and cities, there was a 90% die off from the smallpox epidemic. So it spread all through North and South America over the course of 100 years. So the 1600s had saw an apocalypse with a massive die-off. So as the settlers, the people from Europe were coming west, they were encountering people who had been through hell already. So the population had been decimated. There was fewer than there had been, but they were encountering cities. They were encountering farming villages. If you look around the Navajo area, there had been cities, and there were still people living in these cities. So the idea that these settlers were conquering an untamed wilderness was untrue. I just need that um, on the record before we start. Um, what did I want to tell you about the Plains Indians? There was the biggest bit of conflict as people came west after the Civil War, because by the Civil War, most of the native populations, the vast majority, had already been pushed west of the Mississippi River. So after the war, as people came west, that's when they started encountering the different plains warriors. And of course, there was going to be conflict because they had many of those or people were from tribes that had lost their land. So 1830, President Jackson oversaw the Cherokee removal and the Trail of Tears, where people were marched from Georgia and marched from Florida barefoot in the snow to Oklahoma. There was, I'm not sure of the death rate from that, but it was pretty astronomical. So the Western tribes already knew of the hell that had befallen the Eastern tribes, and they were going to fight. Here, I want you to just look at this. This was a Pueblo city, a Taos Indian city. So I'm going to zoom in on it. Look at that architecture. That is not um, unsettled territory.
No, it's not.
That's a group that had been living there thousands of years. But it didn't fit the American mythos. So, and of course, not only were there Native Americans already west of the Mississippi, there were also all of California, all New Mexico, Arizona, Texas. I'm leaving out some states, were all Spanish Mexican territory. Those were all part of Mexico until 1848 when we got them after we had the Mexican-American War. 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, and they knew they weren't going to win that war, and so they surrendered all that land to us. So, uh-oh, I'm going to pause the recording. And see. Okay. Okay. So yeah, there were a lot of people of Mexican descent in the West, along with all the Native Americans in the West. And then there were all the well, Canadians, but people of French descent there because all the Louisiana Purchase territory had belonged to France, and there were tons of fur trappers. And if you go to the West Coast, and there were tons and tons and tons of Chinese laborers that had been asked to come over. So,
That's
okay,
kidnapped.
well, okay, some were kidnapped, some were, well, things are bad here. Let's go to the New World and make a fortune like we've been told we could. And there were also people saying, hey, come on over. We need you here. We need laborers. Come on over. So, yeah, there was a mix. Yes. But coolies were indentured servants that they specifically sold themselves into a type of temporary slavery, just how the Irish got here in the early 1800s was by selling themselves into a period of bondage, usually about 7 years. But that was temporary. Of course, most people died before they made it out of their term of indenture, but that's a whole different story. Okay, so I told you about this, that there were tons and tons of Mexican forts. This had all been Mexican land. So the English only business, like, was theirs first. So yeah, just like Florida had been a Spanish territory, I think until 1827, I think. Don't quote me on the year. But yeah, this was Spanish territory. But those cowboys that our myths love so much? You watched that Roy Rogers and what's his name? The one that played Genghis Khan? John Wayne. Well, I'm Genghis Khan. Okay, so John Wayne movies, Roy Rogers, all that, the lasso, the hat, lariat, and bolero. What's it called?
Rawhide.
Yeah, but all those things that we think of as the cowboys were actually ripped off from Mexican ranching. All those words like lasso are all Spanish words.
Oh my goodness.
So even this great myth we have of the cowboy is a multicultural myth. So yeah, the West was an exceptionally multicultural place. It wasn't an equal place because as people came over, the people with the like New York financing backing, the people who established big mines were wealthy white people. So they formed a class hierarchy, and they would hire like different groups at different levels to keep the races pitted against each other, because if the blacks and the Indians and the Hispanics started working together, they could unionize. So they purposely had a racial hierarchy in the mines. So, but it was a very multicultural place. Not very diverse with genders, because most of the people going west originally were all men. That changed, of course. I mentioned Chinatowns, and I'm sorry to
Yes.
harp on racism, but the history of America is the history of racism. We did some great things. We've done some really amazing things. And in the 1930s, we decided that it was bad to let people starve to death. So we put in Social Security, we put in like food stamps, we put in social welfare acts. So we've done some really great stuff. But overall, you can't understand the history of America without understanding racism. And the very first anti-immigration laws were against the Chinese. They were a very obvious group. They had a very different language. And of course, when you move to a new place, you're going to want to find people like you. So people tended to settle in communities with people who were already like them. So
Yes.
Chinatowns, I will pause the meeting. And so I'm going to actually read a section of Henry Cabot Lodge's speech as soon as I figure out how to get to it. Okay, so this was written in 1896 against immigrants, because of course it's going to be against immigrants. Every generation has anti-immigrant sentiments. But the Chinese Exclusion Act was first passed in 1880, well, 1882. So there was a 10-year ban on any Chinese immigrants, and those that were here weren't allowed to become citizens. In It was renewed again in 1892, and then they made it permanent in 1902. They had this resume recording. Okay, so I had told the students before you lost connection that Chinese immigrants were banned in 1880. 10 years, none of them come in, none of them can become citizens. 1892, they renewed it for another 10 years. 1902, they made it permanent. Nope, sorry, you can't come in, and even though you're here, you are not allowed to be citizens. But because of the 14th Amendment and birthright citizenship, their children were. How weird is that for their children to be allowed to be citizens, but no matter what they did, no matter how hard they worked, no matter what tests they tried to take, they weren't allowed to become citizens. So, it wasn't repealed until we went to war with Japan, and we decided that the Chinese were cool, but we were excluding the Japanese. So, but the link I couldn't show you because it's not working is Henry Cabot Lodge, who's he had a lot to do with American politics. He's like one of the more famous names, but he proposed a law that if you could read and write in your own language, you could come in, and it wouldn't affect any of the what he was saying were the desirable races to come in, but it would exclude most of everybody they didn't want in. And if you listen to the speech, change the name of whatever immigrant group he wanted to talk about, and it's the same speech that could be made today, honestly. The rhetoric for all these anti-immigration laws always stays the same. Okay, let me from current slide. Okay, here's just a cute family photo of a man and his son sending a photograph home back to China showing their wealth, and the little boy holding his chicken.
That's so cute. That's a chicken.
Yeah, it's a sweet picture because they were proud of the work they were doing.
Yes.
So they got dressed up in their nice clothes to get a family picture.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, I like that one. Okay, if you look at a picture of Boston or of New York, well, Manhattan, you're going to see, I mean, you've driven in both, how
windy and twisty the roads are, and it's like really organic, like building out from the center. And you can tell, right? So, but you've been out west. Like all the roads are set up as grids because when the US territories were being sold, the entire place had already been set up in 36 unit grids. And so in every 36 units, like one has to be reserved for school area, one has to be reserved for like a civic center, a house of government and a church or whatever. And so each of these are parcels already laid out, and you could buy one parcel so long as like one's reserved for the city that was going to be created. And you can see it in the maps of those areas, how grid patterned it is and not organic like the older cities of New England.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Let me see. Do I have the words of the Homestead Act here? Come on. Okay. So it was easy for them to buy land. The Homestead Act of 1862 permitted settlers to buy plots of 160 acres really cheap if they promised to live on it and make improvements. Um, in 1873, it was amended that people were required to plant trees. And in 1877, they made it that it was even cheaper, but they had to promise to start irrigating within 3 years. But a lot of this was really difficult because trees weren't growing in that area, and there was very little to build with. So independent homesteaders didn't do as well as people who were funded, obviously. And once the trains got started, things got to be easier because those original people coming out west had to bring at least a year's worth of food and goods with them to be able to make a go of it. Because there was nowhere to farm. I mean, there was no farm set up, and it takes a while for potatoes to grow. There was nowhere to go buy food, so there was no supermarkets. So everything had to be brought with you. That was not a cheap endeavor to buy everything you're going to need for a year for a family. So it wasn't as egalitarian as one thinks because you had to be able to fund yourself through it. Let's see, I've already talked about this. The miners were a big pool. You know who made the most money out of the gold rush though?
The saloon owners.
Oh, okay, yeah. But originally the person who made the biggest money the fastest. Yeah, no, the saloon owners. You're not
The bankers.
okay. Okay. The best story is the people who originally found the first gold streak in California, um, they were going to keep it secret. They didn't want anyone to know. But someone had heard about it. And so he secretly bought all the shovels, all the pickaxes, all the screens to make pans. He went and bought it all. And then he started running through town. There's gold in them hills. There's gold in them there hills. And got
And sold the stuff they would need. That's clever.
yeah. So yeah, he cornered the market on hardware. Kind of wild, huh?
Yes.
Because originally the Comstock Low people were keeping it secret. They did not want people to know about it. For damn good reason. They wanted the gold.
Yes.
But by the time everybody got out there, all the surface gold had played out. So the only people who could make money at it were the people who could dig deep enough, the corporations that could do the mines. So corporations and major mine owners, and then everybody else came out and worked. Let's see. So do you know how long the Old West was open? Like how long it really lasted?
No, I don't.
It seems like it's a large part of our country's history, right?
It does.
So Civil War to 1890s, like 1895, they were like, this is it. The West is closed. There is no more West. So really about 30 years.
That's not very long.
No, it's part of our national mythology, just like George Washington and the Delaware, but it wasn't that long at all. Like in the Cowboys worked for ranching companies. So this mythos of the individual, the rugged individual, it was a guy working for a company. But what happened is in the 1870s, there was like a bad year that killed off a lot of the cattle. And then the next year was another bad year. And after that, like that whole cattle drive thing just really started going away.
Oh,
So here, 1866 to 1887 was the time of the cattle drive and the cowboy.
oh my goodness.
Here is Chisholm Trail, famous for being a movie.
Yes.
Abilene, Dodge City, all these were cattle drive places. But around this time, towards the 1880s, Chicago, because it was becoming the railroad hub of the West, actually figured out it was cheaper to become a cattle, like to get the cows, to
Ship 'em.
process the cows, and then send them as finished meat east, as opposed to putting them in cattle cars and sending them to New York or to Virginia, where they would be butchered locally. Chicago found out it could become a meat packing place and make a lot more money. And they
Mhm.
invented refrigerator cars, which really eased that.
Oh my.
Luckily, the
Yeah,
Great Lakes were good for producing big old blocks of ice that they could keep for that.
comes in handy.
Let's see.
Amazing.
So,
That's
but
neat.
the thing is that the idea of the cowboy, even though it was only like a 20-year thing, became who we are as people. The Rocky Mountain School of Art. There was no school. It was just that style, like Impressionism or postmodernism. So the Rocky Mountain School of Art was just a style that glorified the West,
Oh,
made it look like this place people wanted to go to. Penny
mhm.
novels were being written, so people were writing stories of the cowboys, like, or the Toulouse-Lautrec stories, like all these beautiful things that were drawing people west.
Mm.
So this idea of the cowboy was spreading not just through America, but through the entire world. And people were thinking about this. So when people think about America now in a lot of places, the idea of the cowboys still comes to mind first.
Mhm.
Have you heard English people doing impressions of Americans?
No, I haven't.
They always like will grab a cowboy hat and put on that Texas accent. Because the idea of the cowboy is just that much of our national mythos that's what people think of when they think of Americans.
Oh,
But 20 years, 30 years of our history, and that's it. The Wild West wasn't that wild. Pretty soon, school teachers went out there, wives went out there. It became family homes and stuff, and less of this individual.
hmm.
Let's see, do I have?
Mark
Yeah,
Twain.
Frederick Jackson Turner. I don't have the year of it. I think it was 1883. So Frederick Jackson Turner was a historian that he had a crowded lecture hall. People actually went to hear historians in lecture halls.
Hmm.
Sometimes change isn't the best. But
Oh,
some of his thesis was wrong, but his is the West has always been America's way of letting off social steam. The cities get too big, too congested. People have always moved out west to ease that pressure. And
hmm.
the frontier's full. There's um, no more frontier in America. And that was in the 1890s that he said that.
My goodness.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, Mark Twain, of course, added to that Western mystique. There's just a
Well,
whole
Mark
bunch of names
Twain.
that added to that. Okay, and here we are going to do another content analysis. This is a primary source to study ideas of the past. And what do we
That's
see?
beautiful.
It is lovely.
It's an angel.
Goddess of progress, but yeah,
Same thing.
same thing. I don't like angels, you know that.
Sorry. I like angels.
But anyway, what are we supposed to think about this? What is it teaching us? I have a negative reading of this just because of the way I teach and the way I think, but your generation was raised to see this as a very good thing, right?
Yes.
So feel free to look at this image and then. So you said she's a good figure.
She's like a protector.
Okay, what's she doing?
She's got something under her arm, like
Yeah,
a
she's got,
briefcase.
it's a school book. And
School
do you
book.
see in her hand?
I can't see what's in this hand. A rain? No.
Telegraph wire.
Okay. Telegraph came to the west. Yeah. Progress. Progress. The trains.
They're all going towards that way, yeah.
Everybody's
They're all.
going west.
So what about this side?
Those Indians?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, they're being pushed out of their land.
Yeah, they're not happy.
That's not
And the
nice.
buffalo and the bear. At
Oh,
first.
Oh my.
Yeah. So and what are we supposed to think about it? Look at the sky.
It's dark and cloudy and sad.
Mm-hmm. And she's bringing in the light, pushing out the dark. First, the farmers that were coming in, the miners, beyond them, more plowsmen, like an express instead of just the farmer's cart. Here's more of an express one. It's bringing in the trains. You see the city and ships behind her bringing in. So this is an image of manifest destiny. Did I lose you? Still there, mommy? Okay. So yeah, it looks like she's on hold, but this is manifest destiny. This is the idea of bringing progress. Okay. So yeah, this is a picture of manifest destiny. I'm sorry you're having such bad connection trouble. The artist is John Gast. So looking through it with the lens I do now of anti-colonialism and pro-indigenous rights, I see this as a very negative picture, but your generation, and actually when I was in school, we were raised that manifest destiny was our birthright as Americans. This was what was right and proper, spreading enlightenment, spreading democracy, spreading farming and agriculture across the entire continent, right? You remember that, right?
I remember.
Well, I mean, you didn't do it, but I mean, what we were taught in school.
Yes.
Like Christopher Columbus being a hero.
Yeah.
Now I'm all for throwing over those statues. He wasn't a great person.
Oh my.
I know. Isn't this exciting? I'll zoom in for you.
Yes.
Nope, sorry.
Is that buffalo?
It is. Well, bison, buffalo, same thing.
This is sad, but
wow, no, this is not sad. This is important.
Important, all right.
Oh, look at the mandible. There's a pelvis. Okay, so what would happen is, remember, no grocery stores in the West.
Yes.
This is a kill site for a Blackfoot tribe of Canada. So what would happen is buffalo have this, like actually a lot of herd animals. This is a sad picture, but they will run in a straight line. So what would the Blackfoot would do is they would create these runways. Like they'd put a bunch of sticks with like a plant flag in it. And or did I say sticks, stones, and then they would create this runway and the buffalo would stay within those lanes and they would run them off the edge of a cliff. So they would start stampeding them. They would plan this out days ahead. And then like the buffalo would run into the cliff. By the time the first buffalo get there, there'd be more and they'd fall off. And yes, it's horrible to us now, but no grocery stores and they lived in Canada. Well, even if they lived in like Nebraska or anywhere else, like it gets cold. And things don't grow in the winter. So what would happen is they would have this huge kill site, and they would spend like a month at this kill camp where they would process the hides to make their housing, to make their clothes. They would take the fat, they would render it down. They would mix it with nuts and berries and have this nice like granola type bar. Well, not granola, but what?
Nothing went to waste.
Well, no, this was how they got their supplies for the entirety of the winter. This wasn't we're just going to kill buffalo, where this is your entire, I mean, you remember canning where you would get all your tomatoes and strawberries and preserve them for winter?
Yes.
This is a big old canning session for their entire village. Except they didn't have jars. They would like jerky the meat. They would make those fruit and nut bars out of the fat. Of course, all their clothes. So this was how they did it.
Yeah, okay.
So they relied on having a ton, well, more than a ton, quite a number of tons of buffalo. The way to get rid of the nomadic tribes or the semi-nomadic tribes, because some of them did actually rely on agriculture, but the way to get rid of them was to kill off the buffalo. So not just the American government, but those coming from the East made a systematic purpose of killing off as many buffalo as they could. Because if the buffalo was gone, the natives would be gone. So the trains, because there were so many buffalo, the trains would actually slow down and let people shoot out just like a video game. Oh, wow, I just killed 3 buffalo. Just shoot out the side of the train, slow down long enough for them as they went through buffalo herds. People can be evil, but this was not a way to, it wasn't the plan to exterminate the buffalo, even though that was what they were doing. It was a plan to exterminate the native tribes that relied on the buffalo as their livelihood. This next picture is just unfreaking believable. This isn't all of them. This is just some. Each individual bison skull. How many thousands of animals are represented in that number? It's just, yeah, unbelievable. Okay, for my class, I have them here, Chief Joseph's I Will Fight No More Forever speech. It's really heartbreaking. I'm trying to get through this fast, so I suggest you read it. It's very short. So I Will Fight No More Forever by Chief Joseph. But Chief Joseph was Nez Perce, and he had told the American government he wasn't going to leave his land. So they found someone else that they decided to call a chief, had this alleged chief sign a contract. And they're like, we have proof. See, a chief signed this treaty that says you all surrender this land. It's like, dude, that guy has no right to sign away this land. We're going to fight. And they kept fighting and kept fighting. But in the end, he realized that the Americans have overwhelming numbers. They'll keep sending people forever. And all he had was his village of people. The ghost dance, here's a picture of people performing the ghost dance, was a millennial movement, was a religious movement among the various Native American groups that were still alive, still trying to survive. And they started this ghost dance, which was a religious movement saying whoever performs this would be protected from the Americans' bullets. It didn't work as planned, unfortunately for them. They weren't bulletproof. So there were people trying to not be assimilated, trying to not live on the reservations, but America had a policy. It's called the Dawes Act. The Dawes Act is regarding Native Americans, the Dawes Plan is about World War I debt. There are two different vocabulary words. So Dawes Act was assimilationist. They said, okay, we're going to end tribal land and give everybody their own piece of property. But you're not allowed to sell it. We'll hold it in trust for 25 years. Therefore, you won't misuse it. And part of the Dawes Act was to forcibly take Native American children, they'd put them on a train and take them to what they were calling Indian schools. And the policy of these Indian schools was kill the Indian to save the man. And they would cut their hair, which for many of the tribes, their hair is religious. So they were, their hair was cut, which took away their part of their religion. And then they would take away their language. If they were caught, they were taken away as little kids and they weren't allowed to speak their language. They were beaten if they spoke their language. If they were caught praying to their gods, they were beaten. A lot of kids didn't survive the school. But then they were allowed to leave once they became adults. Imagine if you were beaten every time you learned your that you spoke your language when you were little. You're never going to know your language, right? So imagine going home to your parents and grandparents and not speaking the same language at all because you don't know it. So it was a form of ethnocide. So yeah, that's the Dawes Act. I just want you to know about it. It wasn't repealed until Roosevelt in the mid 1930s. So there was a good 50 years of this. Oh, in Australia, well, this was actually kind of going on though into the 1970s here, but in Australia, they had it even worse. Okay, more systematic. It was still happening here, but the Aboriginal Australians, the state just, oh, well, you don't have electric. You're an unfit parent. You don't have running water in your home. You're an unfit parent, even though there were indigenous groups that didn't need these things. And the children were taken away from loving parents and given away for adoption to white families. And so there's people my age in their 40s that don't know who their mommy and daddy are that are actually still looking for them. So yeah, Dawes Act. Okay, so with cheaper railroad rates, people were going west. But the farmers were seeing this as a conspiracy because it was really, really cheap to get things west, and then they had to spend a lot of money because rates were higher going back east. So there was a lot of tension between the East and West right now, especially over the trains, and we're going to see that come into play later. So they believe it was a conspiracy. Is it a conspiracy when it's just a bunch of rich people making rates? I don't know if that counts as a conspiracy or just them doing good business because there was no government regulations. We got our government regulations of railroads didn't happen until decades later. Farming prices were doing pretty bad once again because there was a lot of competition and it cost a lot to get it to market. These farmers weren't farming for themselves; they were farming cash crops to send to the globe. So this is all going to go into play. The repercussions of this you're not going to see until we start talking about the 1890s, the turn of the century, and even into the 1920s. And Roosevelt in the 1930s came into office trying to deal with the problems of these farmers. So that's it for the West. I am going to stop sharing this recording. Thank you for listening.